My name's Alice. If I've not met you before, I'm part of the team. It's lovely to be here in North this morning. Sunny North, here we are. I'm actually carrying on the series the last week. Though technically today's talk should be, I suppose it's like the next week or the week after the last week or something like that, because I'm actually looking at an event that took place after Jesus had risen from the dead. So we're going to jump straight in and read it. We're going to be in John chapter 20, 24 to 31. If you have got a Bible, you might just want to open it and grab it and have it there so you can stay in it. But if not, it's going to come up behind me as well. So here we go. John's Gospel, John chapter 20, verse 24. And it starts with this. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, which means twin. So Thomas, clearly a legend. That's for those of you in the room that know that I'm a twin. There we go. Now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. You see, and we're going to look at this in a minute. Just in the verses before this, Jesus has appeared in a locked room to the disciples. So now Thomas, we're told, wasn't there. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Amen. Now, I think this story, the story of Jesus and Thomas, or the story of doubting Thomas, as you may know it as, has often been deeply misunderstood. In fact, it was only kind of 10 years or so ago that I heard a story preached. I heard this passage preached on by a guy called Greg Thompson. Is Dave Kemp in the room? He normally would do a little whoop for the, oh, yeah. Greg Thompson. At the time, he was a pastor, and now he runs like a non-profit and is doing amazing, amazing stuff. But his preach on this kind of helped shift my thinking on it hugely, and I've really been grateful for this, because before I heard his talk on it, I never knew really what to make of this passage, if I'm honest. It might just be me, but when I've heard this passage preached on or taught on, when I've read it in my own life, even from very childhood, the lesson that was always taught from it, the lesson to be learned, always went something like, "So make sure that you are not a doubting Thomas." Yeah? Thomas is this example of what not to be like when it comes to faith in Jesus. Otherwise, if you do, you might get a similar kind of telling off, this kind of verbal smackdown by Jesus. That was kind of the message I always heard. Anyone else? Yes. I think reading it in this way is actually quite problematic. Firstly, we end up totally misunderstanding or misrepresenting the disciple Thomas. Like maybe he's not seen in kind of quite the Judas camp when it comes to the disciples, but he's not far off in people's minds. Doubting Thomas, as he's often known, has this kind of bad reputation that is hard to shake off. You know, many years ago now, when I was a child, my grandparents lived down in Devon. And my dad, every now and again, would take us on a holiday down there in the summer. And it was like this lovely big house in Devon. And it was kind of, this was like in the 1980s. It was like really old-fashioned, kind of good grandma house. Do you know what I mean? I can remember the smell of it. It was like this lovely kind of baked bread smell. And I remember, this is how long ago it was, like the wallpaper had that lovely kind of velvet embossing on it. Do you know what I mean? I can still almost stroke it in my mind. And the rooms all had these like really, really heavy, big curtains, that kind of thing. Now, I have no recollection of this story, but me and Chloe, my twin, I can well imagine us actually doing this. But the story goes that when we were very little and we were there one summer, we swung on the curtains. She must have come into the room, my grandma, and seen us swinging like Tarzan on a tree on these curtains. I've got no memory of doing this. But oh boy, did my grandma remember this. For the rest of her life, any time that we stayed there, even as teenagers, she'd come in, say goodnight, and then her parting shot would always be, "Don't swing on the curtains." realised a teenager thing, just let it go. It was one time. I don't even remember it, Grandma. But in her mind, when she saw Chloe and I, that's what we were known for. That was like the narrative that defined my childhood in her eyes. And the disciple Thomas, he has been defined by this story that we're told here in John's Gospel. Or at least he has become defined by how we have understood or misunderstood this story. You know, the nickname Doubting Thomas was not one given to him by Jesus. And Jesus loved to give people nicknames and rename them. Jesus does not give Thomas the nickname Doubting Thomas. Neither did the early church. Do you know, it's only really been in the last couple of 100 years of church history that that name has been used about him and about this story. But like some of the worst nicknames, it's had a habit of sticking. So Thomas, as a person, because of this, has become synonymous for many of us with doubt or a lack of faith. But I've got to tell you, the disciple Thomas was the opposite. He was a man of huge faith. He was an out-and-out legend, this man. You know, earlier on, if you look in John's Gospel, in John, it's chapter 11, there's this moment where Jesus is planning with his disciples to go back into the area of Judea. Now, when he was last there, people tried to stone him. So there's a good chance him going back in that it might not end well. There's a good high risk that he might get stoned. And of course, if you're the disciples with him, you're there as well. So that's like a risky situation. The rest of the disciples are kind of a little bit reluctant to go back into Judea. They start doing a bit of a kind of risk assessment. Jesus, is he sure that's the right thing for us to be doing? Let's think about that. Thomas bursts out with this. This is John 11, verse 16. Let us also go that we may die with him. I mean, wow. This man is willing to die for Jesus. He is all in. You know, later on, church tradition has it that, you know, as the early church explodes into life, Thomas takes the gospel message off into India. He was the first missionary to India. Later on, he would die for his faith as he wanted to, or was willing to in John 11. Thomas was an out-and-out legend of the faith. He's an example for us to follow, not the opposite. So it's problematic. It's also problematic because if this story is kind of understood as a warning story, if that's how it's always taught, then we can then pretty quickly deduce that we should not have any questions or doubts when it comes to faith. You know, I remember as a teenager reading this story thinking, I hope I never get told off. I didn't like getting told off. I hope I never get told off by Jesus. Like, what do I do when I have doubts and questions about faith? Where do I go with those? I don't think I was alone in my thinking. Many Christians have understood that it is not okay to have doubts, and that if you do, the church is not the place to talk about those meaningfully, in case you're made to feel ashamed or lacking in some way. But the truth is, the Bible is full of questioners and doubters. Think of Job. Think of Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations, Solomon in Ecclesiastes. Think in the New Testament, John the Baptist. You know, John the Baptist finds himself in prison. Jesus is kind of starting his ministry. John finds himself in prison, and he has a wobble. He thinks, is this really the one who God sent? Like, is this man the real deal? Because like everything is at stake at this point. And he sends his disciples off to go and ask. That's him having a wobble. Think about the man who begged Jesus to heal his son, and then in a moment of honesty cries, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I mean, that's one of the most honest prayers of Scripture, isn't it? It's one I've prayed many times. Lord, I believe, just help that little part of me, or maybe the big part of me that doesn't believe as well. Questioners and doubters are full of throughout Scripture. They are people who have faith even though. It seems that maybe God has more room for our doubts and questions than maybe the church sometimes does. And as such, people have either walked away from faith or they've looked elsewhere for the answers to their questions, put off by Christians who use this idea of truth as a weapon to smack people over the head with, rather than allowing space and dignity for the questions that many people are asking. You know, Scripture makes it clear that truth is a weapon, but it's a weapon to fight the enemy, the father of lies, instead of weaponizing truth against our fellow human beings. So it's problematic. Finally, it's also problematic because this story is not actually primarily about Thomas. I don't think Thomas would have wanted to hog the limelight here. It's about Jesus. This story is about the new life that Jesus brings. Jesus is the central character here, the one who takes center stage. You know, coming back to this whole chapter, John 20, this moment of encounter between Jesus and Thomas takes place at the end of chapter 20. But if you look through the whole of John 20, you will see that it is all about new life. I know sometimes, like in chapters in your Bible have like a little heading. Well, I don't know what yours might say, but you could literally just cross whatever it says out and just says, Jesus brings life. That is what John 20 is all about. Jesus brings life. John 20 starts with Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene early that Sunday morning, that first Easter morning. And then later on that same day to these disciples. Now they're locked in this room like little kind of scared mice, frightened for their lives. And Jesus just appears in this locked room to them that same day. And he appears to both the Mary and then the disciples on that day, just like fully alive. Having been fully dead, he is here fully alive. And he shows them his hands, his side, where he has been pierced by nails and spear on the cross. And he shows them like he has conquered death and come back to life. I mean, this has been like a brutal, bloody few days for the disciples. But here he is, like full of life, full of resurrection life, because he's not alive in the same way he once was. He now stands there in this new resurrection life, this life that now stretches into eternity. And of course, the Christian message, what we talked about last week at Easter Sunday, and of course, just the very core message of our faith, is that his new life is our new life. His resurrection is our resurrection. That is the Christian message. And so John here, as he's writing his gospel in John 20, he's kind of bringing it into land. He's trying to wrap it all up. And he actually just kind of hoping to land the gospel where he started in John 1. John 1, it talks about, in the beginning was the Word. And he talks about Jesus was life, and that this life was the light to all men. Jesus brings life. It's where he started the gospel. It's where he's ending the gospel. Jesus brings life. And so this whole chapter, John 20, Jesus brings life, includes this encounter of Jesus with Thomas. Jesus brings life. Now, the first part of the story that we read, it comes that moment after Jesus has appeared to his disciples in the locked room. We can assume that then what happens is Thomas comes back and the disciples say, oh, we just saw Jesus. As we read, the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. Now, Thomas wasn't with them in the locked room at that moment. We don't know where he was. We know he probably should have been there, would have been there, because he's one of the 12 disciples. He's like in the inner circle here. I could only imagine how gutted he was to come back and find out he missed out. Can you imagine, what? I go out on the dinner run, and in that time, Jesus was here. So Thomas says to the disciples, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hands into his side, I will not believe. He can't believe it on his friends' words alone. Why not? Why not? Thomas has spent 3 years with Jesus, seen him do incredible miracles. I mean, think of some of the miracles he would have seen Jesus do. He's seen him raise Lazarus from the dead. So he knows he can do it, this kind of death to life thing. Why can't he believe what his friends, disciples, tell him? In fact, Jesus has been trying to tell them all over the last few years that he was going to die and raised to life. Why can't he believe in that moment? I think it's wrong just to kind of, with our modern eyes, just cast Thomas as playing the role of the die-hard skeptic in that moment. I need foolproof evidence. So this man is a follower of Jesus. He's a man of faith. He's not on the outside looking in. He's seen remarkable things. He's given everything to follow Jesus. So he is all in. He's already seen that Jesus, as I said, can raise people from the dead. So why not? Why can't he believe? Well, let's just remember the context here. It's been a brutal few days for the disciples. There's been so much death and pain and trauma, so much fear and confusion. And I think it's in the midst of this exhaustion, that disorientation that can come with deep pain or grief, that Thomas refuses to believe what the disciples are saying. I think he's feeling deeply traumatized. I kind of imagine, I don't think he's accusing the disciples of out and out lying to him in this moment. I don't think that's what he's doing. I imagine he just thinks they're mistaken, that in their grief and turmoil and trauma, that they have mistakenly seen what they thought was Jesus. Maybe they saw a ghost or something like that. Definitely not the real Jesus, really alive, living and breathing, having defeated death and then standing there in this resurrected life and power that I'm talking about. This has all taken place really quickly, 36 hours. Imagine that. And so in the midst of this pain, of his pain and confusion, I wonder if he simply just cannot believe that this is possible, that life can come from so much mess, from so much death. In all my years of church pastoring, I know that this is often so true for so many people finding themselves in a season of struggling to believe in God, maybe struggling to believe in his power or his goodness or something else. You know, the doubts that we have, the questions that we have, if you dig down, actually, a lot of the time, they come from a place of deep pain and disappointment in our lives. You know, a lot of the time our doubts, however we might choose to frame them, are not so much about the rational, but about the personal. You know, those kind of why questions that we ask, the doubts that can creep in, often are just from the deepest places within us. And as we'll see in a minute, Jesus meets Thomas in this place in the most personal of ways. This is not about the rational, it's about the personal. And Thomas meets Jesus in the most personal of ways. So like if you're here this morning and you're in a season of doubt yourself, questioning, the question I'd ask is like, what is it you're asking of God? Like, what is the pain behind those questions? You know, my prayer would be that this morning that you know you're invited to bring that to Jesus and that he will be gracious with you just as he is gracious to Thomas. I believe that many of the questions people are asking who don't have faith are also asking them from a place of pain and struggle. You know, like Thomas, our world has almost been in this kind of collective trauma, hasn't it, over the last few years. Foundations have been deeply shaken. You know, the most recent, there's this survey that takes place every now and again, the Talking Jesus. In 2022, it did its kind of most recent one. And this survey just looks at sharing faith in the UK. Like, what's the state of that? And you know, they identified the most common question asked by people without faith in Jesus. Like, if I did like a poll, like family fortunes, what do you reckon that would be? I don't think you'd come up with it. This is the most common question being asked by people without faith right now in the UK. I mean, there was a other kind of category, so there'd be lots of other things, but this is the most common. Will everything be okay? Isn't that interesting? Will everything be okay? This is the question being asked the most in this current moment in history. You know, we've been living in this time of like deep skepticism and doubt, where everything is kind of deconstructed to the point when you can't find truth in anything, you know? You can't trust anything. And therefore, what the kind of current cultural narrative is that the only answers to the questions that you have are based on yourself. So like everything will be okay in answer to this question. Everything will be okay as long as you make it okay. That's what your life is about, making it okay. You know, go on this journey of truth. It's right within you. Find that. That's how you're going to be happy. That's how everything will be okay. It's all on you. I mean, what a nightmare, don't you think? To find yourself, if that's what you believe. That feels like a nightmare to me, where you are the only answer to the questions you're asking. Will everything be okay? But you know what, as I said, we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks, we're starting a new series next week. It feels like this is kind of starting to wear thin, this way of thinking, that people are actually, because of this kind of foundation shaking that's been happening, people are starting to return again to faith, to spirituality in general, to answer the questions that they have. Will everything be okay? And that's why we have to allow space for people to come and ask those questions here in church. To come and ask those questions to those of us who have seen the risen Jesus in our own lives, who know that Jesus brings life. He brings the only life. People have to know that it's okay to question our faith. That our faith can take it. Like that our faith is built on a person. So we don't need to feel kind of insecure by other people's skepticism or worried about having the perfect answer to their questions. Instead, we just need to listen to the pain behind the questions and invite them to encounter Jesus. Remember, years and years ago now, Stephen Fry, you may have heard of, he's like a man, he's an intellectual guy. He's deeply skeptical about faith, about the Christian faith. And he'd spoken out in this interview really like strong, uncomfortable terms about this notion that there could even be a loving God when there's so much suffering in the world. You may remember the moment. And I remember reading it, finding it really upsetting and uncomfortable myself, hearing him scorn God in such a way. It was not like easy reading. But I also remember the torrent of abuse he then got from Christians on social media. I was actually more upset about that response than I was by what he had written. Because the truth is, many of us, people of faith, will have had a similar question, albeit kind of in a different way. Like, God, like, how is it that bad things happen in the world? That's like a big question to ask, isn't it? And to kind of, and to view from our faith perspective, there's still a mystery there, isn't there? Many of us will have asked that question. But instead of grace, he received hatred. And instead of choosing to see the pain in his life behind that question, like, why is this man asking questions about suffering? Not from this objective, rational view. It's not rational, it's personal. Instead of choosing to see his pain, he received rejection. And at the end of this whole blow-up on social media, I can't imagine Stephen Fry was any closer to encountering the love that Jesus has for him in the midst of his pain. I think that when Christians respond like this, we can all have moments where we can respond or want to respond like this, often from a place of insecurity in our own faith. It's tying in with the questions that we have, so we lash out and respond. It's our own inability to admit the questions or the pain or the disappointment in our own experiences, so we get on the defense or the offense. We find ourselves being offensive. Yet admitting what we're not sure of actually just makes us more real to people. And therefore, by extension, makes our faith more real to people and makes Jesus more real to people. Sometimes, as I said, we can worry that not having a concrete answer or a rebuttal to someone's objection to faith can then turn them away from faith. Like, oh, I managed to ask the question you couldn't answer. I'm done then. Oh, gosh. One of the things, though, I often most hear from people that have done Alpha is how actually having a Christian admit to them that they didn't know all the answers actually pulled them towards faith. Because it shows that faith doesn't come from just being able to answer all the questions. It comes from an encounter with Jesus. An encounter that Thomas, in fact, has in our passage. Let's pick it up. Verse 26. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." So notice verse 26, a week later, that's how that began. This is a week later from the moment where Thomas hasn't believed. Thomas is still there with the disciples. He stayed with them. He is still part of that community of believers. You know, if you're here this morning, maybe you're in a season of difficulty or doubt, questioning, staying connected with the community of faith is so important. It can be so easy in those times to kind of want to withdraw and to separate yourself. But don't do that. Don't isolate yourself. It just gives the enemy free rein to come and rob you of your faith entirely when you do that. So if you're in a place of difficulty with your faith right now, don't just pull away. Actually press into community. Stick close to other believers. Like, let their faith be an encouragement to yours. Like, I genuinely believe that you can kind of borrow or steal other people's faith in moments. I know seasons in my own life where I felt like lacking in faith, or I've not known what God is doing. I've just had those questions. I literally think of people I know, many of you lovely lot, and I just steal your faith for a bit and just think, do you know what? I'm not doing this on my own. I literally draw on other people's strength, other people to strengthen my faith to keep me going. I think that's what Thomas is doing probably. So here the disciples are, and then Jesus enters into this locked room. You know, it feels like this kind of new resurrected body can just open doors or walk right through walls. I don't know. Jesus keeps just appearing in the middle of rooms, freaking them all out. And he appears to the disciples. And so, you know, so we just read it. But if you were to compare these verses, like 26, that kind of verse, with what's happened earlier in John 20, the moment where Jesus appeared to his disciples where Thomas wasn't there. If you compare those two moments, the moment where Jesus appeared without Thomas and the moment where Jesus appears with Thomas, they're really, really similar accounts of what happens. They're in a locked room, Jesus appears, peace be with you, and he shows them as scars. It's like Jesus repeats the scene, but this time with Thomas in it. Isn't that amazing? And he greets them both times with this word peace. Hebrew, shalom. Shalom, the word used in the Old Testament to speak of the life-giving presence of God. Jesus brings life. And there he is. And just notice like he kind of beckons Thomas over, graciously kind of meets him in this place of doubt. Earlier on, like Thomas has said, he needs to see Jesus' hands. He needs to put his fingers on the marks left by the nails on his hands. He needs to place his hand into his side for him to believe. Just see how the next verse mirrors what Thomas's doubts. Just see how closely Jesus has heard Thomas's doubts and how graciously he responds. Verse 27, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas, Jesus says, I've heard your doubts and I'm willing to meet you in that place. He's heard them, every detail. And he comes and he meets Thomas in that place. So Jesus here isn't kind of taking Thomas's doubts and just dismantling them one by one. Look, see, here, told you so. No, he meets him with grace and understanding. It's all grace. And Thomas in this moment, he gets to touch Jesus. He gets to see life where there really should have been death. You know, there was a cold body a few days before. And yet Thomas gets to touch Jesus, feel the warmth of his skin. Can you imagine that? He gets to put his hand on his side and feel Jesus taking a breath in and out. Can you imagine it? How deeply would this encounter have transformed Thomas? What an amazing thing. I mean, gosh, I'd love to have been Thomas in this moment. To Thomas's questions, to his doubts, Jesus provides himself. You know, the answer Thomas gets back is Jesus. Jesus who suffered for him on the cross. And Thomas kind of falls to his feet in worship, seemingly. He doesn't say that, but he just exclaims, like, Jesus, you are my Lord and my God. Like that transformation moment. It's like he understands the enormity of what Jesus has done, what he has overcome on the cross and through the resurrection. You know, if you look through the New Testament from a theological perspective and lift off all the theological truths in the New Testament, like out and out, this is one of the strongest theological statements of Jesus' divinity in the whole of the New Testament. And it comes from Thomas in his moment of faith. Like, Jesus, you are my God. You are my Lord. You are my God. Like, Jesus is God. And again, if you want to think about it, like John, as he's writing this, he's like trying to take people back to where he started. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was Jesus. And Jesus was God. Jesus is God. And then here we are, Thomas saying, realizing for himself, Jesus, you really are God. You know, and the whole reason, as John goes on to say, that he's writing this book, is because he wants other people to encounter Jesus like Thomas has done. To encounter Jesus and realize, you are my Lord, you are my God. Thomas says that by believing, you may have life in his name. That's what John writes. By believing, you may have life in his name. Jesus brings life. And it's interesting because Thomas leaves this encounter with a deeper level of faith. It just got really personal for Thomas in this moment. Did you hear how he exclaims? It's not like you are Lord, you are God. You are my Lord. You are my God. Like, faith is deeply personal. And it's like his faith has just like exploded into life. This passage is just as much about faith as it is about doubt. About Thomas's faith as it is about his doubt. You know, it's worth saying that times of doubt and questioning can actually deepen our faith like it does to Thomas. You know, I know in moments of wrestling in my own faith, you know, of course we've had those moments. I've had those moments in my life, those moments of wrestling. They've actually made me more mature. They've deepened my faith as a Christian. Like, more secure in knowing that, yeah, of course, this side of heaven, I will have questions. There's a mystery to our faith. You know, Paul says, 1 Corinthians, he talks about the mystery of faith. He says, for now we see through a glass darkly. Like, there's stuff that we won't know the answer to this side of heaven. But wrestling with my faith has actually shown me that I can just put my faith in Jesus. I don't have to have all the answers, but I do know the person who does. He and he alone is where I find life, where we find life, life in all its fullness and glory. Jesus brings life. And the story finishes like this, verse 29. When Jesus told Thomas, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And then, you know, as I just kind of quoted vaguely, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in his book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You know, Jesus' words to Thomas here, again, sometimes have been understood as a bit condemning, like a tone of kind of condemnation in there, like, you know, Thomas, you're not as blessed because you had to see. Other people who don't have to see are more blessed, kind of thing. I don't think that can be what's going on here, because if you think about it, everyone there in that room has just seen Jesus. So I don't think he's saying, like, Thomas is in the same boat now as everyone else. He's also got to see Jesus and touch him. So I don't think Jesus is saying, well, you guys as disciples who have seen me are less blessed. That just doesn't make sense, does it? It's just not true. I think what Jesus is alluding to is that these people, they're so fortunate, aren't they? I mean, how blessed are they to have seen the risen Jesus? Can you imagine? Like, people did actually see the risen Jesus. Imagine being one of those people. And what these people go on to do is they get to go and then share this story with the world around them, with people who weren't there in the right time in the right place, just like Thomas wasn't there at the right time in the right place the first time. They get to go and share that story. You know, in AD 52, so 20 years later, Thomas journeys 3,000 miles to India and plants 7 churches in the south of the country. Think how many millions of people have come to faith in India since then. He was the first missionary to India. He got to bless those who didn't get to see Jesus for themselves. He got to tell them the story of how he touched him, how he felt his skin. He touched this, like the intimacy of touching Jesus' scars. That was Thomas' story he got to tell all around the world. So I think we should understand this as less of a condemnation by Jesus, more of a commissioning by Jesus. Like, Thomas, you've seen me, now go and bless other people, those that haven't seen me. And of course, it's worth saying, like, Jesus is also kind of addressing us as well as he says this. You know, he speaks to us because we haven't literally seen the physical risen Jesus. Jesus knows, like, how hard faith can be, that journey of faith, that tension of doubt and faith that we live only seeing in part. And to us, he graciously, in this moment, extends his blessing to all future generations who wouldn't see him, his physical presence directly. And he extends this blessing and encouragement to us in this moment. And of course, one day we will receive that directly from Jesus face to face. We get to have our encounter with Jesus like Thomas does. We'll get to see his scars, to touch his side, to feel the warmth, to feel him breathing, to know that even though he bears the marks of death, he is alive. You know, we'll fall on our knees before him and declare, just like Thomas does, you are my Lord, you are my God. Jesus brings life. Amen.